Hey guys, welcome to IB Psychology. Today we'll be looking at the topic of biological approach and more specifically hormones. So we'll be covering what hormones are, particularly cortisol and how it influences human behavior and cognitive processes. We'll be looking at one key study that demonstrates cortisol's effect on verbal declarative memory, providing you with essential knowledge for your SAQ responses. So hormones are basically the body's chemical messengers, and they're secreted by the endocrine glands. And the endocrine glands are basically a system of organs, such as the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, and they work together and in releasing different hormones due to stimulations of the environment, and this causes a response in the body. So today we're looking at cortisol, and this is released by the adrenal cortex during stressful situations, and it can activate fight or flight response. However, it also affects our memory recall, where high cortisol causes memory recall to become worse and causes a reduced hippocampus activity. So children who grew up in stressful environments often have elevated levels of cortisol, and this can impair their cognitive development. Cortisol levels are also released when we don't sleep early, and they can also be released when we're not happy, our mood is really bad. So one possible, and also we'll be looking at a study called the Newcomer study in 1999, and it investigates how cortisol interferes with verbal declarative memory. So one possible SAQ question is explain the effect of one hormone on human behavior with reference to one study. So how we structure an SAQ is we have paragraph 1, 2, and 3. And in paragraph 1, like my other videos, we always talk about the definition of what they're asking, like our key knowledge we have on this topic. So here it's asking us about what hormone is, and we're looking at cortisol. So in paragraph 1, it is essential for us to define what hormones are, where it's released, what it does to the body, when it's released, and all that. And then specifically talk about cortisol and what happens when we have high level of cortisol, low level of cortisol, and what it causes in our body, and where it's released from, obviously. And then paragraph 2, we always talk about a study that supports or investigates this dependence between these hormones. So here we looked at Newcomer study, and we always structure out as AMPFC, which is the aim, method, procedure, finding, and conclusion. And conclusion is in the paragraph 3. So paragraph 3, we talk about the conclusion of the study, and then we always link it back to how this relates to hormones and link it back to the topic, basically. So in paragraph 1, what I said is hormones are chemical messengers that are released into the bloodstream by endocrine glands, and this is because of environmental stimulation. And after releasing these hormones, our body reacts by having a response. So it causes a response. So they travel through the blood to reach their target cells, which causes a response in the body. And they can only affect cells that have specific receptors for them. So if you're releasing let's say progesterone, it will only affect the cells that have receptors for progesterone, and it wouldn't affect other cells. And so now we're talking about a specific hormone that we're looking at, which is cortisol. So one hormone is cortisol, released by the adrenal gland, and is a steroid hormone related to immune system functioning. And then we talk about what high levels of cortisol causes. So high levels of cortisol are associated with high levels of stress and interferes with verbal declarative memory. So now we introduce our study and basically a brief little small sentence explaining what we're going to talk about later on here. So I said here, one research has demonstrated that high levels of cortisol affects our transfer of information from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. So for our study, we always do our AMPFC. So A, M, P, F, and then C is here. So AMPF for the paragraph 2. So we start with the aim. So Newcomer's experiment, I'll color it into different colors. So the aim is Newcomer's experiment aimed to investigate the effect of cortisol on verbal declarative memory. And then we talk about the method. So it was a sample of 51 students. So a sample of 51 participants, aged 18 to 30, and they were randomly selected and had seen a physician before the study began. So for this study, it was the people who were, like I did a little drawing here. So people who were pregnant, had, like, I think it was mental trauma. And they had like some head trauma, or had like not routinely sleeping. They were not routinely sleeping during the night hours. So not routinely sleeping. They were all excluded from the study. So excluded. These people were excluded from the study. And then there was 3 conditions in the study. So the first condition in the study was high level of cortisol, where participants were given a tablet of 160 milligrams of cortisol for each day of the 4 days. And then the second condition was low level of cortisol, 40 milligrams, and the third condition was a placebo. So they were, as we can see here, high level of cortisol, second condition low level, and then the third one was a placebo. So let me just write it here, a placebo. And then it was a match pair design. A match pair is basically when you match with another participant that have very similar characteristics as you, such as the same age, same gender, and all that. And it was a double-blind study. So that's also a part of the method. So the procedure, the participants were asked to listen to a paragraph and recall it. So they were read out a paragraph, and then they were asked to recall it. And then for the findings, we'll use gray. So for the findings, results showed that errors tend to be omission rather than commission, and indicating that the results are not due to attention impairment, but impairment of recall. So the people who couldn't memorize anything or couldn't memorize as well, it was not because of attention, like they weren't paying attention. It was because of their memory, like they couldn't remember stuff properly. And then they found that the high level group performed worse on the verbal declarative memory test than low level group, and they performed below placebo levels after day 1. The low-level groups showed no memory decrease due to practice, which led to getting better at the task. So because the low level were repeatedly doing the task, they got better at it. So they didn't show any memory decrease. And yeah, that's how we structure out a study, a paragraph 2, and we just talk about the AMPFC. And have my little drawing here with the results. And also, the high level of cortisol showed that there was basically, it was the cortisol affected long-term, the transfer of memory from short-term memory to long-term memory, which also affected their recall memory, because you need to store your information in long-term memory in order for it to be recalled. And yeah. So for our paragraph 3, we talk about our conclusion. So I said, in conclusion, the study by Newcomer illustrates how elevated cortisol levels negatively affect verbal declarative memory. So basically a little summary of the results. And particularly impacting the transfer of information from the short-term memory to long-term memory. And the significant impairment observed in the high cortisol group highlights the role of cortisol in memory processes, particularly within the hippocampus, which is critical for learning and memory encoding. So it showed that cortisol affected more in the hippocampus, and their role is for memory and learning, and which was shown here because participants with high level couldn't recall as much as the placebo or the low level group. Thus, this research supports the assertion that high levels of cortisol can disrupt cognitive functions, particularly under stress. And that's SAQ done. So key takeaways are, we have to talk about what hormones are in paragraph 1, define it, and basically say everything you know about it. Put all your knowledge in there and explain what it is, where it's released from, what it does, what it affects. And then paragraph 2 is the AMPFC. And then paragraph 3 is, it's the hardest part to write about, but at the same time, it's very crucial. So always start with talking about the conclusion of the study, and then linking the study to, and the conclusion of the study, link it to the study, link it back to the study, and how this study specifically, so talk about the specific results, and how this shows that cortisol affects our memory, how the study supports the idea that cortisol does indeed affect verbal declarative memory, and how it affects that, to what extent. And yeah, I hope you guys found it helpful, and thank you for watching.